Okay. Hello, welcome to Healing Emotional Wounds to help improve your understanding of trauma and treatment approaches for healing. Welcome to this webinar. It's not a podcast, it's a webinar. Sponsored by Boulder Psychological Services. I am Brooks Witter, and I'm joined by Kimberly Bryan and Karen Eifert. I have a private practice in Boulder, Colorado, and I work primarily with young adults, couples, and emotionally shut down men in that practice. Kimberly?
Hello, this is Kimberly Bryan. I am a family therapist in Boulder. I also support families that are seeking higher levels of intensive treatment and support for their families when needed.
And I'm Karen Eifert, and I am a licensed clinical social worker, and I have a private practice in Boulder as well as an equine therapy practice just outside of Boulder. And I work a lot with adults, young adults, and teens. I do a lot of trauma work, women's issues, that sort of thing.
We are glad that you are with us for this hour, and we look forward to covering some pretty good topics for you. So what we're going to cover today is sort of the basics about what is trauma, what is it, how is it defined, how does it affect our minds and bodies, the signs and symptoms of trauma, and how it impacts daily functioning and relationships. A lot of people come into therapy because they're struggling in their functioning and relationships, having very little understanding of trauma and very little idea that maybe trauma has occurred in their past, and are sort of dumbstruck about what's getting in the way here. So we're going to move on from there, that in terms of sort of how you can help yourself or somebody you love or care about who may be experiencing some of these signs and symptoms, and then touch briefly on some of the common treatment approaches for trauma, and so that you can have an understanding of the different modalities and what might work well for you or a loved one that is in your sphere. So again, we're going to be here until about 1 o'clock. We welcome your input and feedback and questions or clarifying comments. There's a sort of a chat box, I think, that you should be, if you're seeing this live, you should be able to input into, and we're going to see those. We're also going to leave some time at the end for open questions and conversations as best as we can host in this format. So without further ado, should we get going?
Sure.
All right.
Yeah. So what is trauma? So trauma involves experiences or events that that cause overwhelming stress, serious injury, or death. That's kind of what we call big T trauma. In looking at trauma historically, I think people have really looked at veterans of wars, major catastrophe, global events, that sort of thing, as being the only time when people experience PTSD and trauma. And what we're realizing now is that trauma doesn't just include those people who have been victims of violence, sexual abuse, but it also includes kind of the daily events that we experience that our minds have a really hard time making sense of. We all have traumas in our own lives that, while they may not sound like a huge deal to other people, feel very, very painful and impactful on us. So, as I said earlier, big T traumas, things like experiencing physical, sexual abuse, violent deaths, that sort of thing are kind of big T traumas. And then small T traumas can be things like having a really critical teacher or parent growing up, getting bullied, feeling like you're inadequate or stupid, that sort of thing. And so all of those things have an impact on our daily lives. And so that's kind of thinking through trauma as not just the big stuff, but the other individual things. We encourage you to kind of take that perspective on it today.
So, Karen, are you saying that people can experience sort of what looks to be symptoms of trauma, even if they've had, sort of relatively good life, but let's say, a parent was hypercritical or really kind of absent and somewhat abandoning persistently in their early life?
Absolutely, absolutely. I see people all the time who really feel like they have no reason to complain. Their lives have been really good, and yet there may be some old event that happened in the past that keeps kind of reoccurring in their life. One of the things when I describe trauma, I kind of describe it as like a messy desk. Trauma is like that stuff that our brain can't always make sense of, and so rather than being able to file it away into a neat compartment where you can find it when you need it, but it's not in the way, trauma kind of free floats like all the mess on top of the desk and gets in the way when you're trying to do other things, or you can't find the memory when you need it. And so those are ways that trauma kind of gets in the way of our day-to-day living, even if we've had pretty good lives.
Sweet.
Yeah, let's go to the next slide.
Okay. Little T, we've covered that a little bit.
Yeah, Karen, thank you. Great job.
Jumping ahead of myself.
Yeah. We could go even to the next one once we figure this technology out. All right. Okay, so how does trauma affect our minds and bodies?
Yeah, so, oftentimes when traumas happen, whether those are those big T's in the moment or they're the little T's that are chronic and over time, our body and our mind just start to protect ourselves, right? So in that protection, we can look at all of the brain science now and know that actually when we're in high stress situations, feeling super overwhelmed, that the parts of our brain and mind and body that actually are able to think well and make good choices somewhat go offline, and the parts of us that are going into a reactive state come online to protect us. And so people leaving situations, fleeing from them, running away, that would be a sign of flight, shutting down, being avoidant, over time becoming really conflict avoidant, not willing to go toward anything that might trigger some of that trauma. For many other people, the pattern becomes to fight, right? That the moment that there's a threat and the body feels scared, even if it's not something physical, it can be an emotional thing that comes in, and I feel scared or bad or angry, I can go into a fight mode where essentially I'm like a wild animal and I'm gonna do whatever it takes to make that threat be destroyed or go away. And what we've started to learn more and more often is that there's also those who freeze, and rather than fight or run, they just kind of shut down and really can't function, can't respond, can't think. I find that especially people who've had more chronic trauma responses over a long period of time, that person who really battles anxiety on a daily basis, over time will start to freeze up rather than fight or run from situations. There's a bit of helplessness that really starts to take over. And fainting is something that we see that really does link to that freeze response when, for some people in a really extreme traumatic moment, they might actually faint. They might actually just their whole body shuts down. And I think what is important to note about that is that our systems are driven to protect us. And so, that quality of complete shutdown is a protective measure just as much as that fighting or that flighting.
One thing I think is really important to note is that this is a biochemical process. It involves our nervous system, and I think a lot of times people have trauma reactions and feel really ashamed, and feel like if they were just stronger, if they were just a more together person, that they wouldn't be feeling this way. And especially the process of seeking out help that are going wrong is very difficult for some people, because there's shame attached to it. This is wiring. Our nervous system was designed to help protect us in these situations, and these are just our bodies reacting in their most effective ways to protect us mentally or physically from danger.
Yeah. An interesting side note is, memories are processed different under high stress situations. The amygdala is actually responsible for processing these memories in order to keep the organism safe for in future situations. And so when that system is activated in our learning, we start to sort of look at the situation, or sort of replay the situation, and see all the different cues that may be indicating that we are in danger. And so what you see when people have unresolved trauma is sort of the amygdala is starting to sort of be overactive and starting to find the cues in the environment that might indicate, warning, this is not safe. Even when, to a sort of person without that trauma, would see that cue as very benign, because it's associated with the past trauma. Because it's associated with the past trauma, person with unresolved trauma gets triggered into a defensive reaction. And it's really important that this is not a moral failing. This is, like Karen, what you were saying, this is a biophysical response that is evolutionarily adaptive, though in our life, functionally, it may be quite detrimental. And the work there for the individual is to go back and to resolve the trauma. And we're going to get more into that. How do you actually sort of resolve it towards the end of this?
On that note, I may be skipping ahead a little bit, but one thing we're really learning a lot more now about is developmental trauma. These are those traumas that happen to someone who maybe developmentally didn't get what they need. People who were chronically neglected or chronically criticized, chronically abused, where they didn't have the kind of necessarily nurturing or caretaking that they needed at the time. That could, be from the family system. It also could be from, regular medical issues that really interrupted the child's ability to stay with their parents, or to be able to move. Movement after we have trauma is really important. And, for people who are stuck in hospitals and casts or whatever, those are all things that can kind of accumulate and later on down the line lead to trauma reactions. Which I think probably brings us to our next.
Signs and symptoms, I believe. Yes, signs and symptoms of trauma.
So this is not a fully inclusive list of some of the signs and symptoms of trauma and responses to trauma. But for those of you out there who have battled with some of this yourself, or know others who have, I think you'll understand that the vivid feelings and that the trauma is happening again, the flashbacks, is probably one of the most primary symptoms. It's not such that anyone would necessarily know that they're reliving it in the moment, but the body is reacting and responding as though that initial trauma or those initial traumas are happening now. So oftentimes when ourselves or someone else is having a reaction to a trauma response or a trauma trigger, we don't know that we've collapsed into some old pattern or some old fear or what's going on, but our brain is reacting as though those old traumas are active in that very moment, and oftentimes can make one feel pretty darn crazy because they don't know why they're having such a strong reaction to things. Sometimes when the traumas have been, single event or more recent, it can be really hard to stop thinking about them. There's just a quality of rumination of what happened, why did it happen, what could I have done different, how could I have said that different, really trying to fix it in the mind and brain. And oftentimes that's a sign that there needs to be healing work done around that event or that trauma, as someone's really trying to figure out how to have fixed it in the first place. Definitely sleep at night impacts many, many people. I think some people actually sleep deeper and harder who have a lot of trauma, and some people really struggle to get to sleep at all. And that can be accompanied with bad dreams and night terrors. We see that often in children before their body minds have had an opportunity to really lock the trauma all inside their bodies. You know, children who have some trauma in their lives really will dream a lot and work it through a lot in their sleep. So for parents out there, that can be a sign that maybe your child is needing a little more emotional support. There might be some things going on if you're having a child who's having a lot of struggles at night. You know, becoming frightened or upset when reminded of trauma is very real, right? We can point to a narrative around, okay, this horrible car accident happened, or this horrible surgery happened when you were young, or this bad thing happened in your life that was scary. And that's the most overt way that one can be reminded of a trauma. And that in and of itself can bring up, you know, feelings and emotions and flashbacks of memories of those things. It can be very subtle as well. It can be the smell of something, or, you know, a certain way light is in a room, or a facial expression that someone makes. So those more nonverbal and sensory kind of inputs also can be reminders of trauma. So sometimes that's helpful to hold in mind when we ourselves or someone around us is getting kicked into a trauma response, that it might not be something obvious. Anger and definitely irritability and not really knowing why is often a really real reaction and symptom of a trauma. Not wanting to think about or talk about what happened is so very common. And part of why we have jobs is because people go for a very long time being able to successfully not think or talk about what happened, and yet until trauma has an opportunity to be shared and healed and processed through in relationship, it doesn't go away. So even wanting to not think about it or not talk about it, it's still alive inside. And so, and why would you want to think or talk about some horrible event that's happened to you? Being reluctant to go out or be with others, absolutely. Over time, for many, many people, they start to become more and more socially isolating, agoraphobic, afraid to go out and be in the world because of other people, but also because sometimes they don't know when they might go into a kind of anxiety trauma response, and it can be incredibly embarrassing and shameful. Hypervigilance and hyperarousal are really important ones, in that someone who's had a history of trauma or had multiple traumas, oftentimes their whole body mind is heightened in this way that they're scanning, they're looking, they're seeking for any threat in the environment so that they can keep themselves safe. And just that level of heightened seeking and searching and protective energy creates an arousal in the body. It makes it really hard to relax and just feel safe and walk through the world in a way that feels comfortable and easeful. And absolutely, when we've had stressors in our lives, and especially significant traumas in our lives, when we're more stressed in life, we're much more susceptible to some of those symptoms coming back online. So you can imagine, you know, that you have a child who you've worked through a lot of challenges and struggles with that child, and you think that they've so-called, quote, healed their trauma, and then there might be a significant event or trauma in your family years down the road, and you might see that child regress back to a lot of those similar trauma responses that you sought help for in the first place. Because oftentimes under stress, the nervous system does go to many of these symptoms and signs and more.
I'd like to speak a little bit here about one way that I talk about trauma with clients. Is that, you know, facing life-threatening situations is something that we've been dealing with as a species, and before our species even existed. So it's in our evolutionary sort of makeup to have mechanisms to deal with the intensity of those situations. And one thing Peter Levine talks about, who we'll mention in the is he looks at the natural world, and you see, let's say out in the bush or something, an antelope gets attacked by a lion but makes their escape. That is being overrun with stress hormones that are designed to keep that animal safe, to be able to run faster, to be able to jump higher, to be able to escape a predator. And so with all those hormones and the neurotransmitters and just all that energy coursing through that animal, once it's free, it will go somewhere safe, maybe under a tree, and it will just literally shake it off. It will shake its body and vibrate and just gesticulate and just move its energy, right? We're even doing this here in the studio. We're like, yes.
Too bad you guys can't do this. Yes.
And so that's a very natural process for us mammals to be able to rid ourselves of the experience, where we are able to complete what's called the arousal cycle, where at the sort of physiological, the neurological level, we are able to give the message back to our body that it's safe now. We can release all of this tension. We can release these hormones. Yes, we need to learn from this. Like maybe that watering hole at evening is not safe. We'll be more careful. But typically we don't see nonverbal animals suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder in the way that humans do. One of the things that interferes with our ability to process trauma more easily, more immediately, more naturally, is that we sort of overlay our responses with certain verbal rules, dictates, mandates. Oh, just get over it. Just buck up. Oh, it wasn't that bad. Like, you made it. You should be grateful for your life now. All of these rules that get in the way of our ability to really connect with the emotional experience and to attune ourselves to a natural response that would clear us of that trauma from the outset. And again, this is not a moral failing. This is just, I think, my view is a society that's ill-equipped to deal with the emotional reality of that needs taking care of. We'd much rather get on to business, get back to our lives, and get over it without really having much of an idea of what that entails, which often is an intensive period of time to let yourself connect with the feelings and connect with your body and heal. That's one way that I talk about trauma. And when it's stuck, I want to just mention some of the things in the signs and symptoms here. Being unable to stop thinking about it and having hypervigilance and hyperarousal cues for trauma that a traumatized person is sensing doesn't exist outside of their own body. But actually, one of the cues is the arousal of an accelerated heart rate, shallower breath, muscle tension in the limbs. That might happen regularly because they haven't, their neurological system doesn't trust that they are out of danger yet. And so they are continuing to maintain an aroused state of stress. And so then they're, oh my gosh, my heart's beating. What's wrong? Then we start looking for danger. And we might see danger in our partner who is telling us that we left the plate out. Oh my God. And then we have this immediate trauma response that's completely disproportionate to the situation at hand. And it may be that the cues are not external, but actually interoceptive, internal to the person, because that's just where the baseline level of stress is consistently elevated. And they're seeing those stress responses as a sign that there is something dangerous. So this is going to be how it kind of builds this positive feedback loop in a negative way.
Yeah. And I think that also brings up the idea of some people are more prone to experiencing trauma than others. Some of us are wired more sensitively than others. I work with horses, and there are some horses that are far more sensitive who, can be mistreated, and they will remember it for the rest of their lives and react for the rest of their lives. Attention to that mistreatment as much. And we're the same way as human beings. Some human beings are going to be far more likely to have a traumatic reaction to something that happens. And so keeping in mind, when you look at, when you look at children, is this a sensitive child? Is this a child who tends to have sensitive reactions to their environments? Often those people are more prone, more likely to be impacted by trauma. I think another piece that comes to mind for me on this is how often people are diagnosed with other diagnoses when really underneath it, it's a trauma reaction, as opposed to, you see lots of people with bipolar disorder or ADHD, conduct disorder, all of these things that people are looking at the external manifestation of what's happened and labeling it as one thing, when in reality, that's this person's response to the trauma that's happened to them.
Yeah. I think that's a nice segue to our next slide, actually, because we're going to be talking about some of the, the impact on our functioning, our development, and relationships. And, Karen, just as you were saying, that oftentimes there's, outward expressions of trauma that look like other things, like ADD. I see it quite regularly as something that may have some sort of post-traumatic stress that's informing that presentation. Because when we look at how trauma affects the biology, boy, there's probably whole courses on this in graduate training programs, because it's pretty pervasive. We've already talked about that in situations of high stress, we have a different memory system that's coding these situations differently so that we can respond more sensitively to future threats. One of the things that when we are in an elevated level of stress, we also bring resources away from the sort of luxury items of like the neocortex, right? Our high order thinking, our ability to take perspective into the future and take perspective on ourselves and say like, oh wait, I'm actually safe right now. I'm with good people. This is okay. That's all happening in the neocortex. But when we're in a fight or flight response and we have a high level of stress, those resources go to much more primitive areas of the brain, so that because evolutionarily we are priming ourselves for a response to threat, which is very physical. We need to run from a fire. We need to outmatch a competitor. We need to get away from a predator.
So how would we be at math or having a really sensitive conversation if we were in that kind of mode?
We'd be pretty bad. And you can they actually study this, and you will see drops in various levels of very objective measures of quote unquote intelligence when people are under stress. And particularly when you've been under stress for a long time, you see an erosion of these kind of higher order skills that often define kind of our human experience in some ways, is these higher order skills. And so you can see how over time there's a degradation and erosion of one's sense of self and competence if this trauma persists, traumatic stress persists and is untreated, because it does take hits on our abilities to solve complex problems, to have delicate conversations, to engage in intimate relationships where vulnerability is a key component. All of those things are going to be impacted because we are hypervigilant to threat cues. And so we will be misreading our environment as threatening when our partner or our boss or the audience is, quite benign and curious and open.
And I think to bring it to our next point about, the impact on attachment is this very thing, right? That, when the body, this isn't to say the mind and the neocortex is able to think well and say, oh, okay, that person's smiling at me, that means that they're kind and they're friendly. When the body has been given reason, and that might be to not feel safe, the body will seek to create safety in relationship. And so because it's in relationship where the harm happens, and so when the body says, actually, being in relationship is not safe for me, we see what ends up happening. People really do. They choose to either desperately reach for connection and relationship, or they pull away and they don't reach at all. And so when we see this in children, right, we also see how that is going to then impact their ability to learn, impact their ability to get along with other children. If you have a child whose system is just on this heightened arousal alert all the time for feeling safe in relationship with other people, it can make them really hard to be able to relax and see that maybe they are okay.
Mm-hmm.
Can I have one piece on the biology that I meant to share here? Is another thing that happens when we go into a high stress situation, like it takes away from the luxury items. One of those luxury items in a stress situation is our digestion and our immune system. So I just want to mention that that's a pretty common there's a comorbidity often with post-traumatic stress, where people have issues with their digestion, maybe irritable bowel syndrome, Crohn's I've seen as sort of co-occurring, and also compromised immune systems. So they might be getting sick a lot. I've also seen autoimmune disorders be pretty common with trauma survivors, and also chronic pain, where we physicalize some of that stress and some of that pain mechanisms that are far too complex for me to understand.
Absolutely. Yeah. And one of the other ways that trauma really impacts people is on their ability to regulate their affect, to regulate their emotions and how they're dealing with people. So you may see somebody who looks totally normal to you, but their internal experience may be of this like pounding, rapid heart rate, sweating palms, shallow breathing. When someone's in a fight or flight mode, they're really compromised inside, and so it makes it really hard for them to be able to tolerate the emotions and interactions with others. And so you can see somebody. I see this with couples a lot, where there may be one part of the couple who has something that's happening that's really triggering some old stuff with them. You know, my wife's criticizing me like my dad used to, or and that person has a reaction to their wife that has very little to do with what the wife is actually saying, but it's more a reaction based on something that's happened a long time ago. And so that's one of the things we see a lot with people who've had trauma is really kind of out of control emotions. And kids in particular really need us to help them learn to calm. But I think we'll get into this more later on, but that ability to learn how to calm the central nervous system is really important, to then be able to calm and get your brain back online again, so you're able to think again, so you're able to kind of problem solve and think things out more rationally.
And on the flip side of highly dysregulated affect is dissociation. And dissociation is a mark of the genius of our survival mechanisms. So if you are defenseless against some sort of threat, some sort of painful intrusion into your space, violation of your integrity and boundaries, we have this ability to really just leave our bodies and go somewhere else, where our consciousness kind of turns out the lights and surrenders its body for the period of time, only to come back later when it finds itself sort of alone or in a more safe place. And when that stress, if that traumatic event is not resolved, dissociation will be a learned process to protect against stress. And this is very common with survivors of childhood sexual abuse, when there is no way for the kid to reconcile the terror that's coming at the hands of a protector. And it just scrambles the brain, and we go somewhere else. And so dissociation happens on a spectrum. There can be sort of mild dissociative events that are sort of fleeting And there can be large periods of dissociation that look much more like catatonia, where just the lights are out and the body is just a lump of flesh, apparently.
And I think I think it links to our conversation about biology in terms of memory as well. There's the dissociation of driving down the street and being like, oh, wow, I didn't realize I just drove those 5 miles. Where was I? To, wow, I don't have any memory of, years 5 and 15 of my life. I don't recall anything that happened during those years. So, dissociation in its powerful protective measure also allows our brain to split up our memories in a way that feels safe in the moment, feels safe in response to those traumas, but also can be a bit maladaptive over time, to very chronically maladaptive over time.
Mm-hmm. Well, and dissociation can also take the appearance of looking like just kind of distracting activities. So we can dissociate in things like overeating. Eating disorders often have a very dissociative component to them, or picking up the skin or pulling the hair. People dissociate with video games and watching too much television, drinking too much wine, watching too much pornography. There's all sorts of ways that we find to kind of step aside from the intensity that might be going on inside and to kind of check out for a while. So that's something to keep an eye on as well. And just noticing if you've had trauma, notice that you have long periods of time that you can be off doing something like that. It may be a sign that, that there are maybe some other coping mechanisms you could bring on board to help you even more.
Okay, let's move the slide forward. We've got a few more of these impact on trauma. Yeah, we have a few more. So behavioral regulation. One of the things that regulates behavior is our neocortex, right? Impulse control. When that is compromised due to the high stress, as we mentioned earlier, we may see low impulse control and lots of acting out. And this often corresponds with some sort of distressing emotional state. So we might see increased aggression, sort of opposition, defiance. We might see weeping uncontrollably. Might see binge eating and whatnot. And then drinking kind of falls into another category because it's sort of a self-medication as well, but that would also fall into sort of impulse control, particularly when the consequences of the behavior can be so detrimental.
Yeah, I like to think about it that there's a spectrum from high to low, or strong to soft, or being willing to comply versus really wanting to do it my own way. And that somewhere in the middle of all of these different spectrums is health. And oftentimes when people have had a history of trauma, they can become really rigid in the way that they manage their behaviors. And sometimes that can be really, really dysfunctional. And so helping people who have more rigid patterns around how they respond to their trauma is part of the work that we all do each day as therapists, and hope to continue to support families in learning how to do for each other.
So real quickly, cognition is another area where trauma can have a big impact. Kids who are under chronic stress, who have experienced trauma, who are kind of perpetually distracted with just getting through their days, often don't do very well in school. There's a lot of studies coming out now looking at things like brain size of kids who've had kind of normal development versus traumatic development. It's hard to perform in school, and some of that can be short-term, but some of it can have real long-term impact on brain development. I look at some of the kids who've been adopted from foreign countries where there've been there's a lot of neglect and abuse, and often they have some pretty long-standing cognitive issues to deal with.
And then the self-concept. You might imagine that with so deficits being informed by traumatic stress, that with high acting out, with diminished cognitive abilities, with seeing threats in your intimate relations more than safety, that will take a toll on one's sense of self-concept, sense of who they are, their efficacy, their ability to function in the world, because they start to see the effects of traumatic responding in their day-to-day life more and more. And unless that gets treated, unfortunately, that has a potential to sort of cascade on itself, where the acting out engenders more loss and more pain, which then is adding to the stress that they were already struggling to deal with. And so it can be a very, very desperate spiral that can occur here. And, you know, that it can erode the social support if it really goes untreated and the person doesn't get get help that they need, because that acting out does take a toll and patients can wear thin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But there is hope.
There is hope. Yes. Yes.
Should we move on to what to do?
Yeah, let's move along.
Okay.
So what to do if you or somebody you know has experienced trauma? I think the experience of a safe environment and an ability to tap into feelings of calm and safety is really important. So looking for opportunities to feel safe yourself, noticing the places where you feel the calmest, the most nurtured, the most happy and safe. I think we actually don't have this written down here, I don't think too much, but relationship is huge. Relationship and community and connection, I think, are some of the most important pieces to healing from trauma. And so seeking out people who care and understand and can listen to you and validate your experience is super important.
That safety piece, I think, is really, really important, because at the core of trauma is the experience that the world is not safe, because your nervous system is poised for threat. And so, though there's sort of limited ability to have sort of top-down mediation on trauma, what I mean by that is you can't really think your way out of a trauma response. That said, to be able to make explicit when you're in a regulated space, to look around your room or look around your home and just say, I am safe, I am safe. And to make that a practice, to notice when you are safe, and to actually connect with that experience, can start to link up, you know, the cognitive perspective that you have that may be more grounded in a quote unquote reality of the moment, with your nervous system that says, no, I'm not safe. No, I'm not safe. It's, you know, over time, the practice is to eventually take perspective and be able to feel the arousal of threat while holding the security of your safety in the moment.
Yeah, beautifully said. Yeah, and I think oftentimes there's a conversation in a lot of this work about how we need other people to help us to do this. I think that that's a really important thing to highlight, that when we are able to have people in our lives, partners, friends, children, therapists, colleagues who are safe people for us, that we can build our own network of how to keep ourselves safe. So in those moments, as Brooks is saying, is in those moments when we're not actively in a trauma state, taking the time to remind ourselves, I'm safe. I'm safe right now. I'm safe in Dan Fox's office. I'm safe right now. But also having people online in our lives that we can reach to, who also can be that voice for us in those moments when we can't for ourselves, can be really important.
Animals. I can't say enough about animals, dogs, horses, cats. They provide just this kind of unconditional positive regard for us, and that physical connection, the emotional connection is all really important. And often being with humans can be threatening and overwhelming. And so animals are a really great way to kind of segue into that. And validating, I think, is a skill that is so important to know about. We have a tendency in our society when someone's struggling to kind of ask them to kind of get over it and move on. To have the pull yourself up by your bootstraps, like suck it up, you're fine. Kind of.
It wasn't that bad.
It wasn't that bad. Why are you making such a big deal about this? This happened 20 years ago. And really what we need when we experience something traumatic is someone to say, oh my gosh, that must have been so hard for you. That ability to have someone else and acknowledge and validate our experience is hugely healing. And it's healing for ourselves, because sometimes the hardest people to get validation from is ourselves. So that whole idea of like, your childhood wasn't that bad. Like, look at all these kids, you know, in other countries that are suffering. It's really important for us to be able to actually give ourselves some compassion for the experiences we've been through that have been traumatic for us.
Yeah. Another practice is really learning, how do you regulate your nervous system? And that's going to be different for each person. So there are some common ways. Getting out in nature is often a great way to regulate your nervous system. Hiking, provided that you feel safe. Taking baths, learning relaxing breathing techniques, stretching, hanging out with your animal, enjoying a cup of tea. You know, sensual experiences can be quite grounding, in the sense of bringing you into the present moment, where you're contacting the safety of this moment, and able to sort of create a little bit of gap, a little distance from being fused with the threat cues of the nervous system when it's starting to kick up. A huge piece of the work, and what's often called resourcing, is what are the resources that you have that you can turn towards when the traumatic responding gets kicked up, because it will. And so learning how to dance with that is half.
And in many ways, we're utilizing the beautiful plasticity of our brains and our brain's ability to heal itself. And what we're talking about in this right now, and what Brooks just spoke to in this next bullet point about, you know, when talking about it, even just remembering safety, 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 that, you know, if myself or someone around me's brain is in a trauma state, that's a brain that's scared. And so we need to help that brain learn that it's actually safe. And that doesn't just happen by, you're safe, get over it, right? That happens by, you know, slowly, carefully, lovingly, gently rewiring or wiring, maybe even for the first time, more and more experiences, corrective experiences, positive healing, restful experiences that allow the brain to actually believe something different, to know something different in the experience.
Yeah, because one thing that can happen when we're talking about a trauma is that we can actually re-traumatize ourselves. So if we catch ourselves having those physiological responses, the shallow breathing, the sweaty palms, the racing heart, that sort of thing, it's really important to find ways to bring ourselves back to a regulated state after we experience that. Talking about trauma is all that needs to happen, and really talking about it in the wrong way and not helping someone to resource and pull themselves back together afterwards can actually be more harmful. So noticing, are you somebody who starts talking about the stuff that's happened to you and you find yourself getting more and more dysregulated and unhappy and scared? That's a sign that it's time to do some resourcing, help pull yourself back, and getting that neural pathway really strong that goes from I'm dysregulated and feeling really anxious and scared, back to, okay, I feel safe. Really working. So when you notice yourself getting a bit dysregulated, finding ways to come back to a place of calm and peace, and keep working with that neural pathway, because that is your area of strength. That's how you heal from trauma.
Yeah, and so often people come to professionals to help them work out their traumas. And so when you are looking for somebody to help you with trauma, or help somebody that you love and care for with trauma, it would be good to know about the different approaches that are, well validated as being effective. Excuse me.
In our offering to you guys of approaches, we've highlighted 3 pieces of literature that we find to be really supportive. Sometimes especially when it's yourself who's working through trauma, going to books and trying to learn about the healing process from books can be helpful and supportive. And I want to highlight here the importance of just what Karen was speaking to, of dropping in and pulling out, right? That reading a book about trauma can in and of itself, as healing as the book might be in the long run, be very, very activating and traumatizing. And so taking the time you need, little bits, bite-sized pieces of what you're able to sit with and process and learn as you go through that. And then I really strongly believe that any therapy that's going to be effective and safe for healing trauma has to be trauma-informed, has to have some underpinning of the neurobiology of trauma and a sensitivity to that, and blended with understanding the relational safety that's necessary for trauma to heal.
About 8 minutes left, and we want to encourage, if anyone has any questions, feel free to type in any questions because we're happy to answer those. In our last few minutes here, if we don't have any questions, we can talk a little more about just some of the approaches that are out there that we know of that we think can be really helpful as far as trauma goes. So one approach that that I work with, and kind of the one that I know the best, is called EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And it is a method that that works with bilateral stimulation of the brain, similar to when we're sleeping and we're in a REM sleep. If you look at someone and their eyes are moving back and forth, that is what they're doing to kind of process the day, is what we really think is happening there. And EMDR is a method that integrates that idea. There's a lot of research supporting the effectiveness of EMDR with trauma. It's I think a pretty gentle approach that allows someone to kind of process through trauma that's happened to them. And I kind of liken it to the difference between watching a movie in HD, where everything is vivid and bright and loud and you experience everything, to kind of turning it into a black and white film. And so if you're experiencing traumatic reactions, you're having more of an HD kind of reaction. And the process of EMDR can kind of take that and just turn it down, make it less impactful. And so that's one method that I know of that I think can be really effective with trauma.
So brain spotting essentially is an evolution that came out of early EMDR work, and it really works with the bilateral stimulation that EMDR is so known for, and also uses specific eye focusing. It can be certain spots, it can be certain distances away from a person, really to work with activation and resourcing within the body. So where EMDR is really focused on processing, oftentimes processing narrative, brain spotting really goes into processing the sensation of the narrative.
And then somatic experiencing is really kind of a bottom-up processing of the sense of the traumatic response, and just in order to discover a felt sense of safety and connection in the world. And so the somatic experiencing really does not say that you need to relive the narrative of the events, but that the emotional content is there, and it keeps representing itself to you as an opportunity to be worked through, as an opportunity to go through the complete arousal cycle, so that we no longer feel threatened by the cues of the historical threat, if that makes sense. We develop a confidence in our ability to actually feel the feelings, move those feelings, and let them run through us. And there's another component which I really like, which is that we need to give the body the message that it can win those battles, that it can escape, or it can fight back. And so to develop, so for example, if I had a client in my office the other day, and we were talking about something that was quite activating, and he felt like his legs just started to shake. And I said, well, exaggerate that shaking. That legs is your flight response. You want to run. You want to run away. So let's just exaggerate that running and go with that. And we were able to sort of just kind of imaginally where he was able to get away and escape from that threat. And it's amazing how it happens just so physiologically that we don't, it's like you can sort of get into a video game and have the same experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're able to process that experience and move through it and open to it, there's opportunity for that healing to naturally sort of go through that process to resolve, like the shaking antelope after the near-death experience.
Mm-hmm. There's many different depth psychotherapies. Ones that come to mind right now for me are Gestalt and internal family systems. Yeah, and really with the depth psychotherapies, how those are beneficial with trauma is really in allowing the opportunity to go deeply into how the trauma has impacted the internal system, the personality system, the psyche, the sense of self, and how there's sense of self parts that are healthy and sense of self parts that are actually quite destructive in one's life, and allowing those different aspects within to work together and understand each other so that there can be healing on a deeper personality insight level.
Yes, we just got a question about sort of, chronic traumatic stress responding, where, even if you learn to feel safe, the possibility of regression remains. And yeah, that is a very real piece here. And this is where this is a process, and it requires a lot of care and patience. And, I'd say that it's a hard one. It's that feeling of safety is hard earned, and there's a desire to hang on to it and cling to it. And I would say that over time, over multiple iterations, that, like what Karen was talking about earlier, that pathway from feeling dysregulated back to feeling safe needs to be sort of well trod, and that only happens with time and with dysregulation and bringing your skills to bear time and time again. And I would also encourage, finding a trusted guide, a trusted healer to help with that as well.
I think it's really important for people who are survivors of trauma to know and to have as part of their healing story that perhaps this is lifelong work, and that as things happen and life happens, stressors will continue to come, and we get to continue to learn how to handle it again and find new supports again and keep healing ourselves.
Thank you so much for spending this hour with us. We are at our time. You can find this for future use at the Boulder Psychological Services YouTube. And you can also find more resources and find more information about us and other practitioners at boulderpsychologicalservices.com.
Thank you.
Bye.